In the spring of 1998, a floor manager named Reed Mullen stood at the edge of the burn pile behind Kellner Lumber in Pendleton County, West Virginia, and watched one of his planer operators drag a canvas tarp across the wet ground toward the offcut heap. The operator was Darian Voss, 43 years old, son of a man who had worked the same mill for 28 years before him, and what he was doing looked to Reed like a man collecting garbage. Cherrywood scraps, curved edge pieces, live edge slabs, the curved outer billets the saw always cast aside. Reed said what he would say, and Darian nodded once and kept loading the tarp. Jump ahead to September of 2013. A buyer named Margaret Soren drove 4 hours from Charleston to a 900-square-foot workshop outside Franklin, West Virginia, spent 40 minutes alone in a wood room without saying a word, and then offered Darian Voss $3,800 for each matched guitar set she could buy. She bought 40 sets that morning. She did not negotiate the price. She had driven from Nashville to see if the wood was what the luthier form said it was, and she paid accordingly. Between those two moments stretched 14 years of burning, and everything that follows is the story of what was lost in the fire and what was saved from it. Darian Voss was known in Pendleton County for two things: his silence and his ear. The silence was constitutional. He was not unfriendly, just economical. The ear was professional. He had been running a planer at Kellner Lumber since 1993 and could hear a buried knot or a grain reversal in a board before the machine complained about it. He was, by all the measurements that mattered at Kellner, a good employee. He showed up early, maintained his tooling, and never argued about his assignments. His father had been the same kind of man. Everett Voss had worked the mill from 1961 until 1989, retiring with a bad hip and a notebook he had kept for 20 years in the breast pocket of his work jacket. The notebook was not a diary. It was an observation record, and it contained nothing that would have interested Reed Mullen or any man who thought about lumber in cubic feet per hour. Everett had written grain counts per inch for various pieces he found interesting. He had sketched the orientation of heartwood and sapwood in cherry cross-sections. He had made a note, sometime around 1974, that the off-cut pieces smelled different from the main stack, sweeter and more resinous because the cherry sap ran densest near the bark. He called it, in his careful block printing, "The outside is the gift the inside doesn't know it's giving." Everett handed Darian the notebook when he retired. Darian read it once, put it on a shelf in the garage, and went to work at the mill where his father had spent his life. Reed Mullen arrived as floor manager in 1997. He had a degree in forest products management from West Virginia University, 7 years with a commercial lumber consolidator in Ohio, and a genuine commitment to the principle that a mill's value was measured in throughput. He was not a bad man. He was, in fact, a thoughtful one. The kind of manager who remembered his employees' birthdays and argued competently for their raises. He simply believed, with the complete faith of a person whose model had always worked, that the offcut pile was waste by definition. You ran logs into boards. The boards had value. The curved edge pieces you could not stack or sell in standard dimensions were the byproduct of producing value, and burning them 3 times a year was orderly management. When Darian came to him in the spring of 1998 and asked if he could take the offcuts home before the burn, Reed thought about it for approximately 10 seconds and said yes. It cost the mill nothing. He watched Darian drag the first tarp load to his truck and said, with a friendly smile that was not unkind, "Man's got himself a little hobby." Let me tell you about cherry wood because what Darien knew and Reed did not is the foundation of everything that came later. Black cherry, Prunus serratina, is a medium-density hardwood that grows across the Appalachian region in a particular way that commercial forestry has largely trained itself not to notice. It is not the fastest-growing species in a managed forest stand. It is not the most impressive in width at harvest. For most of the 20th century, it was cut primarily for cabinet and furniture use, where figure and color were the selling points, and it was priced and graded accordingly. The cherry that Kellner Lumber processed came mostly from second-growth stands on the ridges above the South Fork Valley, trees that had been growing on that particular ground for 60 to 100 years, slowly, in the thin soil above limestone bedrock. The growth rings were tight. The wood was dense. None of this registered in the board-foot price, which was the same for fast-grown valley cherry as for ridge-grown mountain cherry, because the market did not have a grade category for what tight rings did to the acoustic behavior of the wood. What the commercial market had no category for, and therefore did not value, was what cherry does when it vibrates. Its density sits in a range that produces a warm, clear mid-frequency response, without the harshness that maple can carry or the muddy, low overtones that mahogany sometimes introduces. Among luthiers, the instrument builders who spend their working lives understanding how wood vibrates, cherry had a quiet, respected reputation as one of the finest back and sides woods for acoustic guitars in North America. Not loudly respected, quietly. The kind of knowledge that circulates in a specialized community and never quite reaches the commodity market, because the commodity market has no mechanism for pricing what only specialists understand. The problem was supply. Cherry was cut for furniture. The wood that appeared in luthier supply catalogs was expensive, inconsistent, and almost always kiln-dried. This is where the second thing Darien's father had understood matters. Kiln drying is the standard commercial process for removing moisture from green lumber quickly enough to sell it on a useful timeline. You stack the wood in a heated chamber, run controlled airflow through it, and drop the moisture content from 60 or 70% down to around 8% in a matter of weeks. It is efficient, predictable, and produces wood that is dimensionally stable for furniture and construction. For instrument building, it is a problem. Wood dried quickly under heat retains internal stresses that the slow work of time and air would have released gradually, cell wall by cell wall, as the moisture migrated outward through the wood's structure at the rate the surrounding air could accept it. A kiln-dried guitar top or back, built by even the most skilled luthier, spends the first decade of the instrument's life slowly releasing those stresses as it acclimates to humidity cycles, expands and contracts with the seasons, and settles into its new role as a vibrating membrane. The instrument's voice is constrained, slightly, in ways the player cannot name and the builder cannot predict. Professional guitar players sometimes describe the phenomenon as a guitar opening up over years of play. What they are describing, without knowing the terminology, is a kiln-dried instrument slowly doing what air-dried wood would have arrived ready to do. There is a third thing, specific to the offcut geometry, that Kellner burned 3 times a year. The mill cut for width, meaning the primary saw stroke was always aimed at producing the widest possible flatboard from the center of the log. The curved outer piece, the live-edge slab that carried the outermost growth rings of the tree, was always discarded because you could not stack it in standard dimensions and because it did not resemble what the grade table said lumber was supposed to look like. That outermost piece, though, contained the rings closest to the bark, the tightest and clearest and most acoustically active wood in the log. For a guitar top, which must be split or resawn from a billet, and then book-matched along the center seam, the narrow, curved offcut, properly resawn, yielded the most consistently quarter-sawn material in the entire log. The grain in those pieces ran nearly perpendicular to the face, which is exactly what an instrument builder specifies, because quarter-sawn wood is stiffer across the width of the plate, moves less with humidity changes, and transmits vibration with less loss. The mill was discarding the best part of every cherry log it processed. Darian's father had not known this in those precise terms. He had known it the way a man who works wood for 28 years in the same climate comes to know things by feel and by smell and by watching which boards behaved and which ones warped. He had written in the notebook that the offcut pieces, properly dried, went quiet in the hands, by which he meant they stopped moving, stopped cupping and checking in a way that wider dimensional boards often did not. He thought this was about the grain direction, and he was partly right. The deeper truth was about time, and about the particular gift of a curved piece from the outside of an old ridge-grown tree that a volume operation had no way to see as anything other than the byproduct of making something useful. Darian stacked his first load of cherry offcuts in the garage in the spring of 1998. He had a rough-cut chop saw and a thickness planer he had bought second-hand, and he began resawing the curved edge pieces into flat billets, stickering them with wooden spacers to allow air circulation on all faces, and stacking them in the far corner of the garage against the north wall, where the light never hit them directly. The humidity in western West Virginia runs between 40 and 60% through most of the year, exactly the equilibrium moisture content a tonewood supplier would specify for air-drying instrument-grade material. He was not trying to supply luthiers. He was not thinking about guitars yet. He was doing what his father had done before language attached to it. His blue-tick coonhound, Morel, slept on a pile of cedar shavings near the planer and woke up when the machine ran. In 2003, his neighbor Travis Hensley came to him with a proposition. Travis had spent 3 years watching the regional cherry market and concluded that the opportunity was in dimensional lumber for furniture makers. Clear cherry boards, 4-quarter and 8-quarter, dried and delivered on schedule to the cabinet shops and custom furniture makers in the mid-Atlantic region who were paying a premium for American hardwood. Travis had done the math. He needed a bandsaw mill and a small kiln, a $47,000 investment, and he was looking for a partner. He had a loan arranged at Pendleton National, 5 years at 6.8%, and he needed $15,000 from a co-investor to complete the equity. Darian said no. He did not explain his reason at length. He said he did not have the money liquid, which was true, and he said he thought the furniture market was complicated, which Travis took as polite skepticism about market forecasting, and which was, in fact, a thing Darian had read in one of his father's old notes about what happened to specialty lumber markets in recessions. Travis shook his hand and drove away in his truck and ordered the mill 2 weeks later. Through the middle part of the decade, Travis Hensley's operation was, by every visible measure, the better bet. His kiln turned stock in 3 weeks. He was delivering clear cherry at a consistent 6% moisture content to 4 furniture shops in Virginia and Pennsylvania. By 2006, he had paid down $18,000 on the equipment loan and was running the mill 6 days a week. That same year, Reed Mullen stood at the front of the Pendleton County Timber Producers Meeting in the VFW Hall in Franklin and gave a presentation about Kellner Lumber's efficiency metrics. He had slides. One of them described the mill's waste management protocol, and he mentioned, with what was clearly intended as a kind of paternal humor, that the mill accommodated a small number of employees who had an interest in the offcut material before it was processed. He glanced toward where Darian was sitting in the third row and said, with the mild fondness of a manager who thought he was being generous, "Some of our folks have a little hobby with the scrap wood, which we're happy to support. The room registered this as unremarkable." The men around Darian did not look at him. A hobby was a hobby. If you have ever been told that what you are doing is a hobby by a man who genuinely cannot see it as anything else, you know what that word does to a room. Darian drove home without speaking, went to the garage, opened the notebook his father had kept for 20 years, and read the entry about the outside being the gift. Morrell followed him in and lay down on the shavings and did not move until morning. It was around this time that Darian built his first guitar. He had never intended to. He had been reading over the previous few years in the luthier forums that were beginning to appear online, and he had come to understand what his stacked wood might be worth to the right buyer. The reading had also taught him enough about the building process that he wanted to understand what he was selling. He did not have training. He had, by 2007, 9 years of air-dried Pendleton County cherry in his garage and a deep working knowledge of how the grain ran in his boards. He built a small-bodied acoustic guitar over the course of 8 months, in the evenings after his shift, from a library book and the forum posts and the logic of his own hands. The bending iron he made from a section of steel pipe and a propane torch clamped to a vise. The molds were pine, rough but adequate. He selected the top first, spending 3 evenings going through the 1999 stack, one billet at a time, tapping each piece near the center and listening to the pitch it produced and the speed with which the tone faded. Wood that sustains the note when you tap it, that rings rather than thuds, is wood with low internal damping. He was looking for a ring. He found it in a narrow curved piece from the third run of 1999, a billet he had almost discarded because the live-edge curve made resawing it awkward. The tonal tap was so clean that Morrell lifted his head from the shavings and looked at him. He matched a second billet from the same run and glued them at the center seam. He found back and sides material from a 2001 batch that had gone still in the stack, that flexed without memory when he bent a strip between his hands, a sign that the internal moisture had equilibrated entirely. He shaped the plates over 6 weeks of evenings. He bent the sides over the pipe with steam from a wet cloth. He built a simple bracing pattern he had drawn from a photograph in the library book, modified slightly based on the stiffness he was measuring by feel as he went. The finished guitar sat on the workbench for 2 weeks while he looked at it. Then he took it to the music store in Elkins, where a man named Pruitt, who had been teaching guitar lessons in the back room for 22 years, agreed to play it. Pruitt played it for about 10 minutes. He played scales, then finger-picked a piece Darian did not know the name of, then strummed open chords and listened to the sustain with his eyes closed. He said that it did not sound like a first guitar. He said it sounded like something that had been played in for 20 years. He asked where Darian had trained. Darian said he had learned from a library book. Pruitt looked at him, and then looked back at the guitar and said, "The wood did most of the work." Darian said he understood that. He took the guitar home and did not pursue sales. He went back to work. Through 2008 and 2009, the furniture market contracted sharply and stayed down. Travis Hensley lost his Virginia client in the fall of 2008 and his Pennsylvania shop the following spring. He refinanced the equipment loan in 2010, extending the term and adjusting to a variable rate he thought would stay manageable, and sold 12 acres on the north end of his property to close a gap in his operating account. He did not go under. He stayed in the cherry business, leaner, and was not broken. What he had was a credentialed operation under real pressure from the same market that had told him the investment was sound. Darian's stack of cherry was not for sale and was not under pressure and kept drying. By late 2011, the first serious signal came that the world around Kellner Lumber was changing. The mill's big contracts had always been in dimensional lumber for regional construction and cabinet-grade material for furniture distribution. Both of those markets were soft. A corporate timber products company out of Ohio had been buying up regional mills and converting them to fiber supply operations for paper and engineered wood products. The margin math favored chips over boards, and the corporate buyer was offering Kellner's ownership a price they found difficult to refuse. The announcement came in the early spring of 2012. Kellner Lumber was converting its primary production to wood fiber supply. The selective cut program, the dimensional lumber lines, the grading operation, all of it was being restructured. A chipper was coming. The burn pile was going away because there would no longer be offcuts to burn. Everything that came off the new cut would go through the chipper and into the fiber supply stream. Reed Mullen delivered this news to the floor staff on a Tuesday morning in March. After the meeting, he found Darian in the yard and told him specifically about the offcut program. He said, "We're shutting down the hobby pile, Darian. Chipper's coming. No more burns, so no more pickup runs." He said it with a kind of brisk efficiency, the way a man closes an account that was always a minor line item. "Should have told you sooner, but I figured you'd find other wood to collect." Darian did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How many board feet you think we burned over the years, Reed?" Reed looked at him. He had not thought about it in board feet. He thought about it in labor hours and burn permits and the quarterly cost of the permit service. He said he didn't know the figure offhand. Darian said he had been counting on his end for 14 years. He did not say what the number was. He walked back inside. He had not said it to be cruel, and Reed, who was not a stupid man, had heard something in the silence after the question that he did not entirely understand. That spring, Travis Hensley got the letter from Pendleton National about his equipment loan adjustment. The variable rate had moved. The new monthly payment was $430 higher than what he had budgeted, and with his production volume down by nearly half from its peak, the margin was thinner than he had allowed himself to admit. He called Darian that evening, not to ask for money, just to talk to someone who would not give him advice. Darian listened. He said that the wood would outlast the rate. Travis didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said he wasn't sure his bank account would. Darian went to his wood room that evening and counted what he had. 14 years of collection across roughly 42 runs, resawn and stickered, and slowly losing moisture under his garage roof. He had approximately 1,400 board feet of Pendleton County black cherry, the best of it now 15 years into its air dry, the newest of it 2 years old, and still settling. He understood now, something he had not planned to have. The entire usable supply of what he had been collecting, because the collection was over. There would be no more. The Kellner burn program had ended, not because anyone had stopped burning, but because the mill itself had stopped making the cuts that produced the offcuts. The resource was gone. What was in his garage was what there was. He pulled Everett's notebook from the shelf and opened it to the note about the outside being the gift. Morrell came in from the yard and lay down at his feet on the workshop floor. In August of 2012, Calla Voss came home from Marshall University with a degree in music business and a set of opinions about the commercial viability of artisan woodworking that she did not try to soften. She was 25 years old and direct, which she had from her father, and she had spent 4 years studying how music products moved through markets and how small producers routinely failed to connect their supply to the buyers who would pay for it. She had written her senior thesis on the failure modes of regional craft suppliers, specifically quality without market access and material without communication, producers who could make the thing but could not explain what they had to the person who needed it. She walked into the wood room on her first full day home. She spent not 3 minutes, but closer to 15, moving through the stacks the way her grandfather's notebook described. He had moved through piles at the mill, touching faces, lifting corners, looking at the end grain. She did not know the technical vocabulary yet, but she knew how to look at something carefully, and she had been reading the luthier forms in the weeks before she drove home. She put her thumbnail against the face of a billet from the 1999 stack and dragged it along the grain. The surface was so stable that the mark barely showed. She said that if the wood was worth what her father thought it was worth, it needed to be in front of someone who could tell them the price. Darian said he was not sure it was ready to sell yet. Calla said, "The oldest of this has been drying since before I started high school. When would it be ready?" He did not have a good answer to that. He knew the wood was ready. He had known it for at least 3 years. What he had not been able to do was attach a market to the knowledge, because the market required translation, and translation required the kind of sustained commercial attention that he could not give the project without leaving the mill, and he had not been ready to leave the mill. The mill had left him. She found the luthier forms online and began posting in September, carefully and without photographs, asking whether suppliers of premium air-dried Appalachian cherry were known in the instrument wood market. She framed the questions as research because she was still establishing what she had before she claimed to have it. The responses came back over the following weeks, and several of them described exactly the supply gap. She was beginning to understand her father had spent 14 years inadvertently filling. One of them was from a luthier in Cincinnati who said he had been looking for properly seasoned Appalachian cherry for 6 years without finding a reliable source, and asked if she had a contact. She gave him Darian's number. He called on a Thursday evening. She sat in the workshop during the conversation, watching her father answer questions about grain count and moisture content, and the provenance of the timber stands above the South Fork Valley, with the same precision he used to talk about everything else, exact and measured and without exaggeration. He said the oldest material had been on stickers since the spring of 1998. He said the ridge-grown trees above Kellner's cut unit had averaged 12 to 14 growth rings per inch on the billets he had measured. He said the air drying had been continuous, stickered undercover in western West Virginia climate conditions, which put the equilibrium moisture content in the range the luthier was describing. After the call, she said, "You've been thinking about this for a long time." He said he had been thinking about it since 1998. She had known her father her whole life and had never heard him claim that much time for anything except the work itself. She took out a legal pad and started writing. By December of 2012, word had moved in the luthier supply community from the forum posts through a small network of instrument builders who paid attention to wood provenance the way sommeliers pay attention to soil. A buyer in Nashville had been asking her supplier network whether anyone had a reliable source of properly seasoned Appalachian cherry. The supplier network was small and specific, and it pointed, eventually, to a listing Calla had placed on a Tonewood supplier forum with a photograph of a matched guitar set Darian had resawn and photographed against a light source so the grain showed clearly. Margaret Soren reached out in January of 2013. She was a senior buyer for an acoustic instrument supply house that served 64 independent luthiers across the South and Midwest. She was 44 years old, deliberate, and not in the habit of driving to West Virginia to look at wood that might not be what it was represented to be. She had been in the Tonewood supply business for 19 years and had seen enough optimistic listings from rural producers to be skeptical of anything that sounded too convenient. Air-dried Appalachian cherry at 15-year seasoning was exactly the kind of supply gap that buyers learned not to believe in until they stood in the room with it. She drove anyway in September. She did not send a representative. She came herself, which told Darian something without either of them having to say it. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a clean gray sedan that she parked carefully away from the edge of the gravel drive. She was wearing practical clothes with no insignia on them. She shook Darian's hand and Calla's hand and said she would like to see the wood first before they discussed anything. Darian showed her to the wood room and left her in it. He went outside to the splitting block and worked kindling for 40 minutes in the early September light, while Morrell watched from the step. Calla stood in the doorway of the workshop and watched through the single window as the buyer moved through the stacks without haste. Margaret Soren did not check her phone. She did not take photographs, at least not at first. She moved the way Calla had seen her father move in the woodroom, touching the faces of the billets with her palm, lifting a piece from the stack and holding it at different angles to the window light, reading the figure and the grain run, pressing the face with her thumbnail and listening with a slight tilt of her head to the sound the thumbnail made dragging across the surface. She tapped the end grain of the oldest pieces with a knuckle and held still for a moment after each tap, her eyes half closed. Calla had spent 8 months in the luthier forums. She understood what the buyer was doing. She was listening for ring and sustain, wood with low internal damping rings when you tap it. The tone carries for a moment before it dies. Wood still holding kiln stress or internal moisture, thuds. Margaret Soren tapped piece after piece, and each time the wood answered her the same way. And each time Calla saw the buyer's expression settle slightly, the way a person's expression settles when a thing is confirmed. She came out after 40 minutes and stood in the yard. She looked at Darian. She said, "How long has the oldest of this been drying?" He said some of it had been on stickers since the spring of 1998, 15 years. A few pieces nearly 16. She was quiet long enough that the sound of the creek at the bottom of the property became audible. Then she said, "I'll offer $3,800 per match set. Back and sides and top, quarter sawn book matched, to the specifications I'll send you. 40 sets today, with a standing order agreement for whatever you can supply going forward at the same rate. Reviewed annually." She said it the way she would have said it to anyone. It was a business offer. She had done the math before she drove from Charleston. 40 sets. The numbers settled into the yard the way a stone settles into still water. Calla had a pen in her hand, and she stopped moving it. At the regional cherry stumpage rate in Pendleton County in 2013, a board foot of cherry was worth $1.10 on the open market. Darian's 1,400 board feet, valued at commodity rate, was $1,540 total. That was what Reed Mullen's model said the wood was worth. On the occasions Reed had thought about it at all. At $3,800 per match set, the first purchase order came to $152,000. He said yes. He said it the way he said most things. Once, without elaboration. Calla wrote the number on her legal pad and then sat down on the step in the doorway of the workshop because her legs had arrived at a conclusion that her mind was still processing. Morel moved from the step to her feet and stayed there. The number was not what stopped her exactly. It was the arithmetic underneath it. She had driven home from Marshall with a careful story she had been telling herself about a father with an eccentric hobby that they could modestly monetize, maybe sell a few sets a year to interested builders at a reasonable premium. The number on her pad was not a reasonable premium. It was what happened when a patient man let knowledge compound over 14 years while a well-credentialed industry burned the same material 3 times a year and filed the burn permits and called it efficient management. Reed Mullen calculated the figure 6 months later when Darian finally told him what he had been asking about in the mill yard. 18,000 board feet of Pendleton County black cherry, burned in 42 fires over 14 years. At the rate Margaret Soren had paid per matched set, assuming a 50% yield from raw offcuts to finished guitar billets, the ash pile behind Kellner Lumber represented somewhere between $300,000 and $350,000 of acoustic instrument wood. Reed sat with this for a long time. He was sitting at Darian's kitchen table when he heard it, and he had come there in the early spring of 2014 because a luthier in Nashville had mentioned Voss Pendleton Cherry in an interview with a guitar building magazine, and the name had found its way to him, and he had not been able to stop thinking about the question Darian had asked him in the mill yard. He said, "I didn't know that's what was in those pieces." Darian said, "Oh, I know you didn't." Reed asked if he could see the wood room. Darian took him in and showed him what was left of the stock, now arranged in the order it had been collected, oldest to newest, with a handwritten card on each stack giving the year and the run number and the grain count per inch. Reed stood in the room for a long time without speaking. Then he asked if there was anything he could do, if there was a way to find more of the material. If Darian knew of other mills in the region that burned their offcuts, Darian said there might be, and that he would let him know. It was not an invitation exactly. It was the kind of opening a man gives to someone who has stopped dismissing what he can see in front of him. And it was more than the conversation had offered for 14 years. Calla drove to 4 counties in the summer of 2014 and spoke to mill operators about their burn programs. She found 2 operations in Tucker and Grant counties that still conducted seasonal burns, and she arranged collection agreements for their cherry and hard maple offcuts before any of the operators fully understood what they were agreeing to. She was 27 years old and had her grandfather's notebook in her bag and her father's precision in her questions. She paid 50 cents a board foot for green material and stickered it in the new covered drying shed Darian had built on the 8-acre property over the winter. Travis Hensley drove over in August of 2014 to look at the shed. He had restructured his operation around smaller volume custom orders and was doing well enough to keep the mill running, and he was not bitter, which says something about the kind of man he was. He stood in the shed doorway and looked at the stickered rows and said he wished he had thought about it differently in 2003. Darian said he was not sure thinking about it would have been enough. You had to have a father who had noticed something in 1974 and written it down. Travis said that was probably right. By 2015, 6 guitar builders across the country were listing Voss Pendleton Cherry by name in their instrument specifications and in the promotional materials they sent to buyers. A luthier in Oregon put it in the description of a fingerstyle guitar sold at a Nashville auction for $9,000, noting in the listing that the back and sides were Voss Pendleton, air-dried West Virginia, cherry, 15-year season. The buyer asked the luthier where the wood came from. The luthier explained. The buyer called Calla. The operation stayed at 8 acres. Darian refused an offer from a Nashville investment group in early 2016. He said the wood had to come from where it came from and had to dry where it dried, and that scaling the supply meant industrializing the collection, which meant kiln drying what you couldn't air dry, which meant building a business around the one thing he had spent 14 years not doing. Calla read the investment group's term sheet and told them the same thing in more formal language. She had begun building guitars herself that winter. Not because she needed to, the supply business was sufficient, but because her grandfather had built one before the notebook was a notebook. Had built it from cherry he pulled from a slash pile in 1963 and air-dried for 3 years in a root cellar, and she had found the evidence of this in a photograph at the back of the notebook that she had not noticed before. The guitar in the photograph was not labeled and not signed, but the grain orientation on the top was exactly the pattern Everett had sketched in the notebook's 3rd page. She drove to her great-aunt's house in Elkins and found the instrument in a back closet in a canvas case. She brought it to her father's workshop and played it for the first time in what her great-aunt said was 30 years. It rang like something that had been waiting for the question. She handed Everett's notebook back to Darian that evening. He set it on the workbench under the single hanging lamp and did not open it immediately. Morrell was at his feet on the workshop floor, old now, gray around the muzzle, his breathing slow and easy in the way of an animal that has long since made peace with its particular corner of the world. There is a way of knowing that this story keeps returning to, and it is worth naming plainly before the end of it. Reed Mullen's knowledge of lumber was wide, credentialed, and accurate within the system it described. He understood throughput. He understood yield calculations and drying schedules and market grades. He was not wrong about any of it. He was wrong about one thing. He thought his system described all the value the wood contained. He thought if a use did not appear in the grade table, the material was waste. Everett Voss had no grade table. He had 28 years of walking the same ground, and a nose for what smelled like something that mattered, and a habit of writing things down for no one in particular. What he built was not a system. It was an attention, patient and narrow, and pointed at one specific thing, the outermost ring of an Appalachian cherry tree, and what it did when you gave it time. Darian did not inherit a fortune from his father. He inherited a notebook and a way of looking. The 14 years he spent hauling offcuts home were not strategic. They were not calculated. They were the continuation of an attention that had been passed to him the way all real knowledge passes, not through a credential, but through proximity, repetition, and a willingness to notice what a system could not be bothered to count. Reed Mullen burned 18,000 board feet of it. He was sincere, and he was wrong, and to his credit, he drove to Darian's house and said so when the mathematics finally landed on him. Most people who are proven wrong by a slow, structural argument do not drive across the county to admit it. He did. That means something, and the story would be smaller without it. What the industry measured in Pendleton County in 1998 was cubic feet per hour and board feet per shift and stumpage rates per acre. By those measures, the offcut pile was overhead. By those measures, burning it was correct. What endures is not always what the system can measure. The tightest grain in the log is at the outside, and the outside is the first thing a volume operation discards. What remains after 14 years of patience is not a lesson, exactly. It is a piece of wood that rings when you ask it the right question, in the hands of someone who learned to ask from someone who learned to look. Darian Voss set his father's notebook on the workbench and did not open it. The knowledge was already in the wood.